And so today is the second session of this series, and to honor and celebrate Pride season, this session will focus on pride and also the basics of gender and sexual diversity. And this session is facilitated by the wonderful Kai Scott from an organization called TransFocus. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about Kai. Kai is a social scientist who has spent nearly 20 years researching and educating on complex social problems. He delivers engaging education sessions and compiles insightful data on gender diversity that shift perspectives and result in greater understanding, ease, and support. And I just wanted to mention that I had an opportunity to meet Kai a few weeks ago as we were preparing for this session today. And I also started to follow him on LinkedIn, which I highly recommend for all of you because he shares some really interesting and thought-provoking stuff and content. And what I noticed immediately is that Kai has an incredible ability to translate really complex information into very accessible, tangible, and relatable content while making people feel safe, seen, and at ease. So, Kai, just wanted to say thank you so much for being here today. It is a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for sharing your time and yourself with all of us here at BC Transit, and we are thrilled to have you. And over to you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for that warm welcome and kind words too. It's always good to hear what lands for folks. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to join you all here today to talk about supporting gender and sexual diversity at BC Transit. Just wanted to extend the land acknowledgement that Julia made, which was so beautiful and very heartwarming, and acknowledge that I'm calling from the unceded territories of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh on what's also known in Vancouver. In particular, I always like to remember the place names, the Squamish place names of the place where I live and work and play. And it's called Ialchin in Squamish, which means on good footing. And I think that's beautiful to honor the connection to land and sea and animals over time out of mind, but also as like a really powerful analogy for what we're trying to achieve on this topic of gender and sexual diversity. And that's particularly poignant, as Julia mentioned, because of Indigenous History Month, to recognize. And we'll talk about Two-Spirit people in particular, which is an Indigenous-specific term. And so we'll get a little bit deeper into that in a few more slides. We've already had a bit of an introduction of myself, so I won't spend too much time here, but I will mention, my name is Kai Scott, and I use the pronouns he and him. With TransFocus Consulting, as Julia mentioned. And, you know a bit of my professional background, but I did want to add a bit of personal context to this as well. Of course, this is not just something I do professionally, but there's a personal touch point in that I am a transgender bisexual man. And so we'll unpack some of this terminology because there's a lot going on in just that one small statement. And there's two distinct things there, both in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity. And so we'll give you some kind of terms and concepts. We'll keep it pretty high level, given that we have other things that we're wanting to cover. And certainly I'm one of so many other people in this very broad community, a very diverse community. And so I will share a bit of my story, but I will also add in other stories and stats to kind of fill out the picture a little bit more, because of course it's not just one set of needs, it's actually a spectrum of different things. So I just wanted to recognize that before we get started. The whole frame of this session or this talk is about active allyship. Certainly, I'm sure you've heard about allyship along the way, and there's different components to allyship, which we'll be kind of going a little bit deeper into in this session. But really, it's about creating safety at BC Transit to us LGBTQI folks. And don't worry, I'll break down that acronym in a few slides in case it's maybe a little bit new to you. There are some unique issues that we'll talk about today, and it's good to be aware of them so that if you see them or observe them or, encounter them, you're able to take action on those. And action can look in many different ways. It's not meant to be one script that you memorize and then, implement perfectly. It's really about being dynamically with folks and interacting in ways that are true to you as well as helpful to others. And as part of that, there's a bit of active listening with humility to appreciate that none of us know everything. And so we're always continuously learning on different topics, myself included, on other equity topics. And so we can, if we are able to show up for folks, that can make a huge difference in people's lives in a positive way. And just recognizing that everybody plays a role in creating safety, whether that's in very small ways, everyday ways, or maybe bigger systemic ways. And you're not meant to know everything. I don't think most people in the 2S LGBTQIA community expect everybody to know everything. And so it's really important that it's okay to ask for help. If something is just not clicking or not understanding, or you want to clarify, that's very much, people are very much open to helping out folks. And we'll be talking about mistakes because people are very afraid, myself included, on other topics of making mistakes. And so we'll show you how to repair those if they do happen. And just recognizing that, we're not aiming for perfection, we're aiming for continuous progress. And just briefly on mistake, this is a very high level set of notes before we go into detail later on in the session, but it's okay to make mistakes. I know people want to avoid them at all costs, but unfortunately, if something is new to us, we're bound to make mistakes. And really, it's about taking the time and effort over time to unlearn habits that perhaps we have, gotten into over the years. And really, it's not so much that you make a mistake, it's how you handle the mistake that makes a huge difference. And so we'll give you tips and tools on how to show up in a good way. And if you do take this seriously, then that really makes a big difference because it shows you care. So it's not, people really focus on the mistake, but really if you're able to correct it in a good way, then that really shows that person that you are taking this seriously. And of course, if you find yourself making a persistent mistake, there's perhaps a little bit more attention needed to make that go smoother for you. And there's ways to do that with coworkers. So we'll give you some tips on that. I just wanted to start off with that because I know that's usually something very big in people's minds on this topic, and of course others as well. So what we're hoping to cover here today is we've got a bit of an introduction that we're going through now. We'll have an icebreaker as part of that introduction just to ease us into the topic, get us to understand what's at play. Then I'll provide a bit more background, especially on what is pride, where did it come from, why is it important, that kind of thing. And then we'll go into terms and concepts to give you a high-level overview of the different parts of the community and perhaps also different needs. And then we'll go over some of the overarching challenges that 2S LGBTQI folks face. Some of those come to play in the workplace, but they also happen, out and about in society at large. And then we'll zero in on a specific type of challenge that is fairly reoccurring and very challenging for folks to navigate. And so we'll give you some insights into how to help and to show up in a better way for 2S LGBTQIA folks. And that's whether you know somebody or not, right? So it's hopefully valuable no matter if you know somebody. And then from there, we'll wrap up and we'll have maybe 10 or so minutes for Q&A. Of course, I invite Q&A throughout. We have a bit of housekeeping here. So we'll have several anonymous polls throughout the session, and we'll be doing that using Mentimeter. And we'll give you the code for that in just a few slides. But I will put it in the chat as well. Just hit send on that so you can see the code for that. It's menti.com and then the code that I've provided there. And we'll also be able to submit questions, anonymous questions using Mentimeter, which for some people, if they're maybe feeling a little self-conscious about their question, maybe you don't want to put it in the chat, that's a good avenue for raising questions. But if you're comfortable sharing it with everybody, feel free to put it in the chat as well. So we'll be staying in touch and interacting with each other in these different ways throughout the session. Before we go into the icebreaker, I wanted to set a safe place for learning because these are many different comments that we hear from folks across the almost a little more than 35,000 people that we've trained are educated on this topic. And these are the reoccurring themes. People are very worried about hurting folks. They may be a bit confused about this topic. They want to know how to be respectful, and they're just nervous. And so maybe you might be feeling this way, or maybe other feelings that are coming up. And so I just wanted to acknowledge those and also say that you're absolutely in the right place. This is for learning and extending your knowledge on this topic. And so, yeah, I just wanted to say, this is here. I'm here for you to help you learn. And so don't worry about, questions and whatnot, obviously, if they're respectful. But hopefully together we can help dissolve some or a lot of these and replace them with something practical and respectful and insightful. So that brings us to the first poll question, which I'm glad to see that people have already found their way to the poll. But you've got the instruction up at the top and also in the chat. So menti.com and then the code 72190113. And we're starting with a question about your own experience. So you don't have to know anything on the topic of gender or sexual diversity, but really to get you in touch with your earliest memory or recall of knowing your gender. And so for some of you, this might be a walk down memory lane. And there's many different contexts in which we have our understanding. And so we've got a few options here for folks to consider. Obviously not an exhaustive list, but maybe the main ones that people reference a lot. And so we'll just give you a few seconds to read the responses and select the ones that are applicable to you. Okay, so the responses are filtering in, but the first two responses, family is a big place where we understand our gender, whether relative to what our parents tell us or perhaps the differences between siblings. Another factor is our own sense of ourself. We have a pretty strong understanding based on it's internally referenced. So that deep internal sense. Also, when we go to school, we start to notice, different washrooms and perhaps teachers line us up in different ways. What we're allowed to play with and or dress in terms of clothing. And there's that difference between boys and girls, especially in past years, but still happening these days. For me, when I was growing up, my mom really wanted me to wear frilly socks with a dress. I don't know if anybody had those experiences of the frilly socks. I was not very keen on those. Perhaps others weren't as well. But I can see clothing as a big factor in about half of the respondents that we received. So that's a big one. Another area is sport. So different ways that people can or cannot play sports. So that's another area. The last one is can't remember. And that's an important one. About a quarter of you responded in that way, and very understandable for many how people saw them on the outside matched with how they felt on the inside. And so there's not really anything to do, to think about, to figure out or say anything about. It just kind of is, and you go about your way, right? So that's an understandable thing. But what we can see here is that there's many different touch points for gender in our society. And in fact, this is only a small subset of that in our childhood, but it grows even more in being in our adulthood, or changes in some ways. But it's ever present in our society, and sometimes it fits for us, and sometimes it doesn't. And no matter our background, this is always kind of there and present. So it's an important thing to kind of check in. We all have a gender. We all have it, figured out in different ways, and this, fitting and not fitting dynamic. And I saw Julia, you raised your hand.
Sorry to interrupt you, Kai. Just a technical question.
No.
We just noticed that
Sure.
while we can see the data, the Menti data updating on the Menti website, we cannot actually see it on the screen that you are sharing. So we just wanted to let you know.
Okay. Yeah. How about this? Does it work now?
It does, yes.
You see it? Oh, sweet.
Yeah,
okay,
super.
Awesome.
Thank
you for that. Good to know that it wasn't showing. Okay, great. Fantastic. Well, thank you for participating in that first poll question, just to kind of get a sense of the lay of the land and, all the different aspects of that. It's really important context before we jump into, a bit more detail. Okay. Stabilizing. Good. Now we'll shift into a bit of background on Pride and just briefly mention the history of Pride. Probably some of you know where it came from, but in case you don't, it did start with a riot, and basically it kind of emerged from a lot of police harassment and basically harassment from police of queer and trans folks. So it was illegal back then to be queer and trans, and so there was constant police action, especially against known places where queer and trans people gathered. In particular, the Stonewall Inn was a place in New York City where people gathered, and it was constantly raided by police. And in June of 1969, folks had enough, and they pushed back for the first time. And that was the beginning of the queer and trans rights movement. Basically, folks were like, not wanting to hide in the shadows anymore. They wanted to be a part of society and wanted rights as part of that. Wanted to acknowledge that, the central role of is particularly trans women of color in the Stonewall riots, in galvanizing folks, organizing folks, taking care of each other in that very tumultuous moment, and certainly have been an integral part throughout the movement as well. So, of course, lots has happened in the last 50 or so years. There's so much more that I could put on this, but wanting to recognize that, we've made very significant progress along the way in different aspects of the community, whether on sexual orientation or sexual diversity, or also on gender diversity fronts. When we're talking about the removal of being gay as a mental disorder that happened in the 1973. Of course, we had the devastating AIDS epidemic that wreaked havoc on the community with not a lot of government support or intervention, which of course just fueled that. And still to this day, there's a lot of pain associated and healing that's happening with regard to that. And we lost significant numbers of our community to that. There was the lifting of a military ban in the 1990s. Sexual orientation was added to the Canadian Human Rights Act in 1996. We had gay marriage legalized here in Canada in the early 2000s. And then from there, it was a little bit more on the gender diversity side of things. So adding gender identity and expression to the Canadian Human Rights Act. Gender X was recently added in the last 6 years to passports. So that's a designation other than male and female. So a third option available to folks who are neither men nor women, which is important official recognition from government. We have a banning of conversion therapy that was used and continues to be used in certain contexts to convert queer and trans folks away from being their true selves. And more recently, we have the trans inclusion counting trans and non-binary folks in the census in 2021. So all this very important progress. I'm sure I've missed so many other pieces, but that just gives you a flavor of the things that we've, as a community, been working on to gain rights and recognition. So next up, just pause. So next up, we'll just briefly want to touch, here we go, Pride parades. And just recognizing with parades, there is kind of that tension between protest and celebration. So there are many things that still need to be achieved. So not everything is fantastic. But also we've come a long way. So wanting to celebrate the achievements, but also continue to push for the change that is necessary. This is particularly important in this age where we are witnessing quite a bit of backlash against 2S LGBTQI folks, particularly down in the United States, but also emerging in Canada as well. And so it's just really important, celebration / protest to come together. But it's also a way for 2S LGBTQI folks to be open and authentic, and show themselves in public. And also for allies to show up and be visibly supportive of queer and trans folks. And it's also a way for allies to learn about the issues to continue their support. Next up, we'll briefly talk about why Pride is important today. Some people think, well, we've come a long way, and so I think for some folks, they think it's largely done. But there's actually so much more that still needs to be accomplished. And so it is a way for folks, if they want to, they can show up as allies to show support of the issues, but also valuable for folks, workers at BC Transit, to show existing 2S LGBTQI employees that they're supportive, and also it might have folks in the crowd that might be prospective employees of BC Transit, and seeing that active support can really send a strong signal. But of course, it's not just about Pride. I know Pride can be a very big focal point because there's a lot of attention and energy around it. It's the summertime too, so it's pretty easy to get out and enjoy a celebration. It is important to have year-round support. So there's many different other days that can be done or can be attended to or paid attention to, whether it's Trans Day of Remembrance in November. We've got Lesbian Awareness Day. We've got International Non-Binary Peoples Day as well. So there's just a few examples. There's others, but just so you're aware of, Pride is great, and then there's the other additional options as well. Just wanted to note that there have been some legal changes. I mentioned it in a previous slide, but gender identity and expression have been added to the Canadian Human Rights Act, as well as sexual orientation as well. You can see they're about 10 years apart in terms of when they were introduced. And essentially, these provide the wraparound protections for 2S LGBTQIA folks. So these are really important legal protections. Of course, there's case law or court cases that sort out the detail of what that actually entails. For example, for trans folks, the washroom access has been clarified over about a dozen or so court cases since the 1990s. So that's been really helpful to know that washroom access is based on gender identity. So one's own felt sense of gender, and it's self-determined rather than being based on sex at birth, as an example. So as a trans man, that's important because I know I'm going into the men's washroom where I feel I belong, and I'm not going into the women's washroom. So just wanted to give you an example of that type of court case. There's also been, besides legal protections, there's also administrative changes that have happened. So I did mention in the previous slide Gender X, but I wanted to show you where across Canada that has occurred, hoping that the remaining provinces in gray will eventually change things over. But for the most part, most provinces and territories have an option, Gender X, and it's also available on the passport federally. So again, important official recognition of people beyond men and women. So that brings us to some key terms and concepts, and we'll basically unpack the acronym 2S LGBTQIA, just in case you're curious. I know probably some folks are familiar with LGBT, and then perhaps you saw it grow to LGBTQ, and now it seems that there are a few other letters added into the mix. So I'll just break those down, hopefully in a simple way, to show that there's actually a few different aspects at play here. So I'll tell you about the concept, I'll define that concept, and then I'll show you what terms are underneath that or kind of a part of that concept. The first is sexual orientation. So that's who one is attracted to. There is gender involved in it, in that we tend to be attracted to one or more genders, but it is about how people relate to one another, rather than gender identity, which is a distinct thing. But before we go there, underneath sexual orientation, we've got lesbian and gay, which I think most people are familiar with in terms of same gender attraction, whether to lesbian, to women attracted to women. Gay can mean any gender attracted of the same gender, but typically people think of it as kind of more gay men. There's bisexual, so attracted to any two genders. Most often we think about men and women being attracted to men and women, but there could be somebody who is attracted to women and non-binary folks. So it doesn't always have to be men and women, just two of any genders. There's queer, which is a more expansive term where folks really don't feel the need to define how they're attracted. They just want, option of whoever they feel attracted to. There can be a bit of a political aspect to it for some folks, where it's trying to push back against the norms that are in society. And there's also asexual folks. So those are folks who don't have any sense of a sexual attraction. They could have romantic attraction, but for many, there's no sexual attraction to anyone, no gender. The next concept is gender identity, and we talked about that in the icebreaker, that internal, deeply felt sense of one's gender. That's the definition. And underneath that, we have transgender, which is anyone whose gender identity is different from what was assumed at birth based on somebody's sex. So for myself, I'm a trans man, so that means I was female assigned at birth in terms of my sex, and I'm a man in terms of my gender identity. And because there's a difference between gender and sex, that's what makes me trans. So trans is a really important term. Of course, there's many different identities underneath that umbrella. Trans man being one of them. There's trans women who are male assigned at birth in terms of their sex, and women in terms of their gender. There's also non-binary folks, so neither men nor women, or exclusively that. And there's also another term, the other part of the A is agender, so having no sense of gender. There's much more to this, but that just gives you some kind of overview of what's happening in gender identity. The other part of the equation besides transgender is cisgender. So that's the majority of folks whose gender identity aligns with their sex at birth. So for them, it's kind of almost, for folks who are cis, it's almost interchangeable, whether you talk about being female or woman. And so, but there's that alignment. Two-spirit, which is the 2S at the beginning of the acronym, is a really important recognition of an Indigenous specific term. Two-spirit, which has many different parts to it. The reason why we've put it between sexual orientation and gender identity is because for some individuals it can span both, or it's just about one thing. It could be about just gender diversity, or it could be about sexual diversity. So it's really up to the individual what is at play for them. But primarily, beyond just being about sexual orientation or gender identity, is it's actually a cultural and spiritual identity, where people have roles and responsibilities in their communities, whether as part of cultural ceremony or relationship building. And so there's a lot more to it than just what we in kind of the Western way of thinking talk about gender and sexuality. Really important to note with Two-Spirit is that it was unfortunately an identity and lived experience that because of colonization has been largely driven underground or completely eliminated in indigenous communities. So a lot of what Two-Spirit folks are doing is trying to reconnect with their past roles, rights, and responsibilities. And that's a very laborious and very difficult process to do, but of course also very rewarding to revitalize that connection. Important to note that it's at the beginning of the acronym in acknowledging that Indigenous folks were first in Canada or in Turtle Island. And so, yeah, it starts off the acronym for important reasons. The last acronym is the I, and that is actually related to sex, which is our like what our anatomy has in terms of sex characteristics, whether primary or secondary sex characteristics, hormones, chromosomes, and so forth. It could be at birth or developed in puberty. And here we have the term which stands, the I in the acronym is intersex. So those are for folks who their body either is born or develops in a way that does not match female and male. So they have, all kinds of other additional or diverse features that we wouldn't find or that are combined with female and male. So this is important. It's the full acronym. It covers 3 different concepts, and there's different terms underneath each of those concepts. So hopefully that was helpful just to unpack all of that. Of course, there's much more, and we try to recognize that with the plus symbol. This is not the end of the story, but it's at least a helpful beginning. I briefly just wanted to mention there's another way of depicting what we talked about in the previous slide, but here is a bit of a spectrum diagram. So it's not just 2 of each on each of the concepts. We're also adding gender expression to the mix because, basically how one looks on the outside. For some people that matches with how they feel on the inside in terms of their gender identity, but not for everyone. And so it's good to kind of have that be separated out. But important to note here, kind of a few takeaways is that it's not just 2 of each on each of the spectrum. And also that in society, we have a very strong expectation that people line up on one side or the other of this visual. But as you'll see, when I put my dots on here, it doesn't quite work out that way for everyone. And so here I don't line up. I wasn't male assigned at birth. I was female assigned at birth, even though I'm a man. And sometimes people are a little bit surprised that I have a more feminine gender expression. It can look when I have my floral prints that I wear. I'm more expressive in my hand gesturing. I'm more nurturing in terms of my personality. I don't know why we've labeled those feminine, but we have. And so, people read me in a particular way. And that leads me to my second or third point is that sometimes people have 2 pieces of information and then they'll jump to conclusions about the other part of the spectrum. So typically people know that I'm a man and I'm expressing myself in a more feminine way, and they'll assume that I'm a gay man, which is based on a stereotype. I'm always very flattered because, of course, gay men are fabulous and amazing. However, that's not accurate to my experience, and people have missed that I'm actually bisexual. And so it's important to hold off on jumping to those conclusions and making those assumptions, and just being open to receiving information if people want to share that. So it's important not to do that. Sometimes people might feel kind of inclined to because we like to put people in boxes. But as much as we can hold an open posture, so much more that we can learn about someone. And perhaps we might even be pleasantly surprised. One last thing I want to mention on gender expression, so how we look on the outside, is that might change based on circumstances. So I used to work in the mining industry. I used to look at social impacts of mining on communities. So I'd go to remote mining sites and talk to all kinds of folks. And it was very clear that feminine expressing men were not really welcome there. It was the jokes that people made. It was the hostile comments, a whole number of things. And it was very clear. And so I very intentionally shifted my gender expression to be more masculine. So I did that so I could be safe. I did that so I could, safely guide people through treacherous terrain, and which is unfortunate that have to kind of shape ourselves into something that we're not. And I don't think that just happens to trans folks. I think that happens to a whole bunch of people where don't quite fit the mold, and so people pretzel themselves to fit in, to not rock the boat, a whole number of things. So hopefully in this type of session and others that we can start to relax some of those expectations and hold space for diversity and different layers of folks. Any questions? I have data for any of the data nerds out there. I'll just check the chat to make sure we're not missing any questions. Okay, and we have some stories being shared in the chat, which I think is wonderful. So thank you for sharing that, the importance of inclusion. Love the visual representation. Great, excellent. So the last point here in this section is just people are curious, how many people are 2S LGBTQIA, and we have, based on the different parts of the acronym, different data. So we know from Census Canada, Statistics Canada, I should say, from the recent census, that 1 in 25 are, part of the sexual diversity, and then 1 in 300 are trans or non-binary. So capturing some of that gender diversity. So it's really helpful. So you can kind of do the math in your head. If you have this many employees, divide by 25, divide by 300, pretty much 2S LGBTQIA folks are everywhere. And I wanted to point out specifically Victoria is, I think, has the most number of, or the percentage of, gender diversity. So trans and non-binary folks. So there's something going on in Victoria. maybe it's the nice weather. I don't know. We'll have to do more research, but an important thing to know. Okay, so next I'm going to provide a bit of an overview of challenges, just so you have a sense of it. Perhaps you know some of the challenges, maybe from media, reading news articles, or maybe in movies, TV shows and whatnot. But I just add a few statistics and some examples as well. So there's two parts to the problem, especially in a workplace context. There's the cultural aspect, so how we interact with one another on a day-to-day basis, or the culture that you're creating at BC Transit. But there's also a structural component as well. And I'll briefly touch on the structural, but we're really focused on the cultural in this session. I didn't want to ignore the structural, just to give you a heads up. You might encounter some of these things. It's basically how organizations, have systems, washroom spaces, all these kinds of infrastructure, nitty-gritty details. So we'll give you some examples just so you know what they are, but then we'll shift to the cultural side of things. So here are some structural challenges where basically if we're collecting gender data, oftentimes there's not enough response options for folks who are beyond being men or women. There's information systems who may not record names properly or not have enough options. So a lot of trans and non-binary folks have a name that they go by on a daily basis that's different from what's on their ID, their government issued ID. This is because it takes a long time and it's a very difficult process, an expensive process to change one's documentation. So for example, for me, I'm a US and Canadian citizen, so I had to change in 2 countries. It took me over a year to change about 30 to 35 pieces of documentation, and it cost me $1,000. And for some, that's just not possible. It's prohibitive, and so it's really important to know that. And so legal documents aren't kind of the end of the story for many trans and non-binary folks. There's also titles, Mr., Ms., Mrs. If you don't have a gender neutral option, that presents a challenge for folks. There's communication, like how are you writing about people. Sometimes people say men and women, but that doesn't include everyone. Sometimes it's just very feminine looking people or masculine people, but not the full gender expression spectrum, including androgyny. There's programs and services. So a women in leadership program is really important, but oftentimes trans women don't know if they'll be included or accepted or welcomed. The last one is washrooms and change rooms, and I don't think there's probably much surprise there, but there can often be not enough options available beyond men's and women's facilities, or even within men's and women's, there's not a lot of privacy, so that makes things more challenging for folks who are wanting to access that. One other information system thing I wanted to flag is that sometimes it's not in most places are better about this, but sometimes forms can be quite archaic and say husband and wife, which assumes kind of people being heterosexual. So that's an example of something on the sexual diversity side of things that can be challenging in a form or system format. But again, we're not going to spend any more time than just mentioning those, so you're aware of them. But if you do see something, it is really important to share with others, perhaps sharing with a manager or, human resources to make them aware of what the issue is. It's okay if you make a quick solution, but really it's important to have those long-term solutions that will be worked on at a higher level. But everybody plays an important role if you're able to flag things, and that awareness of what's happening on the ground is so important. So next up, we have some more beyond the structural, we'll talk about cultural, and they kind of span from the more subtle to the more overt types of challenges. I think people have a pretty easy time of identifying the overt challenges. If there's, harassment, threats, violence even, people know to step in and to say, hey, no, that's, we got to stop doing this. I think people struggle with the more subtle side of things to be like, ooh, I don't know, was that a thing? Should I have said something? And just not sure of what the issues are. And so we'll spend more time on the subtle side of this equation, obviously recognizing that there's a lot of kind of policy or protocol around the overt side. And those are the kind of overt discrimination that is protected by human rights. But the assumptions and jokes and even kind of in the middle with rumors, those are still harmful, especially if they're repetitive. That actually can have a long-term effect and a pretty substantial one at that. I'll just pause here to see if there are any questions before we dive a little bit deeper into assumptions, but I don't think I see any in the chat. I'll just double check here. Okay, no, I don't see anything in Mentimeter, so great. We'll continue on. So next up we have assumptions, and here we are going to look a little bit further into what the issues are, the impacts of those issues, and then what can we do about them? How can we be supportive? How can we show up? How can we do things differently? So there'll be a lot of practical kind of tools and tips in here to solve things. But before we get into that, we have another poll here. And again, it's just from your own experience. Doesn't need to be on gender identity per se or sexual orientation, but just thinking about your own experiences of having repeated incorrect assumptions about you. And if you want to share what that experience is, feel free to put it in the chat. But basically, how do you react when people do that, especially the repeated nature of something? One example that we hear from folks is, I have an accent and people assume I can't speak English. Or, I'm tall and people assume that I play basketball. That's a very common one. People see that I have tattoos and they assume that I'm mean, right? So these are some of the incorrect, repeated assumptions that people experience. And of course, there's a range of different responses that folks have to that type of incorrect assumption. And so we're seeing those responses, and we'll give you a few more seconds to think through, if you have had that experience, what that was like and how you respond. And we can see off the bat that it is pretty frustrating and annoying when that happens, right? So it seems to be a really common experience among those of you who have that experience. Understandably so, right? It's like, ugh, this again, right? Or like, what am I going to do about this? And just not wanting to have to deal with this, which is a totally fair and valid feeling. Certainly appreciating that about a tenth of you experience anxiety around it. That presents a difficult situation of, do I correct this person or do I just let it slide? So it's a lot of like mental calculus involved. Certainly the more egregious incorrect assumptions can produce understandably anger that this is not right. There's sadness, there's loneliness, perhaps even confusion. Like, why are you assuming this about me? Where did you get this? There's also folks for whom it's neutral. There's an indifference to it. It's like, well, that's on them. They made that assumption. Has nothing to do with me. I'm gonna live my best life. So, and then for a small percentage of you as well, you haven't had that experience, which also is understandable. So this is important just to get a good sense of the range of different responses to repeated incorrect assumptions. Certainly appreciating that frustration is a leader among them. So thank you for participating in that and giving us an important context before we jump into a little bit deeper look at the assumptions that folks who are part of the 2S LGBTQIA community experience. And we have a few examples just to illustrate that, and we try to give unique ones for gender diversity as compared to sexual diversity, so different parts of this table. But there's also ones at the bottom that are shared in common between the two. So, for example, folks often assume of trans and non-binary folks that everyone is cisgender. If they see a woman or interacting with a woman, there's a common assumption that she was assigned female at birth. Now, of course, that is the majority of folks, but it is not everyone. And so by assuming, we miss that opportunity or that detail, or providing space for that to come forward if somebody wants to share that. Similarly, on the sexual diversity side of things, there is commonly assumption that, meeting somebody new or everybody talking in a circle is heterosexual. And we know that because of the questions that people ask. When you're meeting somebody new, a very common question to ask is, if you're talking to a man, do you have a girlfriend or a wife, right? So we're trying to get to a better understanding of folks, but the way we're doing that, unfortunately, puts somebody in a difficult spot of either having to figure out, do I out myself as perhaps that person is gay? And, that puts them in a difficult spot. They don't know that person very well. They don't know if it's safe to do so. And so by having these assumptions, it puts people in tough spots. Another common assumption on the gender diversity side is looking at someone, how they are expressing themselves. So if somebody looks feminine or masculine, we then ascribe or put pronouns on that person without knowing anything else about them. And so we jump to conclusions before we've had the opportunity to know more directly from them. We also do that not just with pronouns, but with gender. So if somebody looks feminine, we typically assume woman and she, her pronouns. If somebody looks masculine, we think that's always a man and always using he, him pronouns. But that's not always the case. Sometimes we do that also based on washroom. We expect only feminine-looking people to go into the women's washroom and only masculine-looking people to go into men's spaces. But again, there's a lot more diversity. And of course, that's not just trans and non-binary folks. There are also cisgender people that don't look like we expect for their gender. So we just want to have a little bit more openness to people looking differently in different spaces. On the sexual diversity side, we can sometimes, if somebody is in a same gender relationship, we can often jump to the conclusion that they're gay, right? That may be the case, but in some settings, it could be that person is bisexual or pansexual or two-spirit. Pansexual just means attracted to any gender, so the full spectrum. And so we really don't want to, just because somebody is, say, a woman is with a woman, we don't want to make conclusions about their sexual orientation. If anything, we can be starting to listen for how that person self-describes and then using that language for them rather than us putting a label on them. And lastly, some for sexual diversity side of things, especially around Pride, people are very excited. If they're trying to be good allies, sometimes they'll ask folks and I'll almost expect folks to go to Pride and be involved in the community, in the 2S LGBTQI community. I would say it's fairly complex, that the relationships people have to Pride, and not necessarily everyone is going for their own reasons, and not to kind of lead with that question and not to kind of automatically assume that somebody is really excited or super involved. The last two are that we tend to think that people have similar coming out stories of realizing that they're 2S LGBTQIA and then sharing with others. Either people assume it's like really, really good or really, really bad, and there's actually probably a lot of mixed bag for many folks. And so just letting people share their story rather than, assuming what that was. And another very common but very harmful assumption that folks have of 2S LGBTQIA folks is that people are doing it for attention. This comes up especially when we're talking about young people who are 2S LGBTQIA. They're just like, how could they know? They're so young. But when you think about the icebreaker question, typically we know from a pretty early age who we are. Maybe it's a few things that we need to clarify, but it's really just that we have a pretty strong understanding, and this includes 2S LGBTQIA folks. And people are not necessarily wanting attention, they're actually wanting connection. And so when somebody shares something as deep as their gender and or their sexual orientation, it's actually a huge gift. And sometimes people just dismiss that, and that's very hurtful when that happens, because it takes a lot of, a lot to share about oneself in such a vulnerable way. And I would say that's especially the case for youth who are trying to open up about themselves. So we have a few other kind of tips and tools. Before we jump into that, I just wanted to clarify how misgendering happens. I explained some of that in the previous slide, but just break it down a little bit frame by frame. So when we meet somebody, whether on the phone or by text or face-to-face, there's kind of certain pieces of information we're taking and then jumping to conclusions. So, but it is based purely on kind of the shape of somebody's body, what clothing they're wearing, their voice, facial hair. There's all these different pointers. We might even just be unconsciously doing this. But by phone, it tends to be somebody's first name, which is typically very gendered. Say, for example, Tom versus Tanya. We have different genders attributed to those names. By phone, it's also by voice, so high-pitched, low-pitched voice. By email, it could be a combination of first name as well as a salutation or a title, like Mr., Ms., Mrs. Face-to-face, that's where it gets kind of the more complex, multiple pieces that we're drawing on between name, voice, and how somebody looks, and what clothing they're wearing and whatnot. So you can imagine just in a split second, we're taking in this information and then being like, okay, that's a man or woman, and then these pronouns. And we might not even realize we're doing it. And we have an example down here below. One thing to note is that some people are misgendered or use the incorrect pronoun everywhere. Anywhere they go, any person, new person that they meet, they're getting misgendered. Others, they might have a mixture of different misgendering. One example for me is if people don't know that I'm trans, they actually see me for the man that I am. However, and they're using the proper pronouns and whatnot based on assumptions. But where I get the most trouble is actually by phone. For some reason, I think my voice translates differently over the line, and I get a lot of misses, ma'ams, and so forth. And so it's like, it's pretty startling when it happens, and it's very frustrating as well. Even though I'm sure the person on the other end didn't mean any harm, but just, again, are making those assumptions. We know from data that misgendering happens a lot, especially to non-binary folks. So folks who are neither men nor women who go, say, by gender-neutral pronouns, unfortunately are misgendered most of the time, like daily, 60% of them, and about a quarter of trans men and women are misgendered. This is a survey of 3,000 trans folks across Canada, and unfortunately, they don't feel either safe or able to correct folks in the moment. And so 70% of non-binary folks don't correct people. It's a very difficult situation to figure out whether to correct, how to correct. And it's just a lot of emotional labor for folks in ways that some just don't feel they're able to do. And yet they're either quite or very upset by that experience. And so it weighs on people. It's a very difficult experience to navigate for folks. Impacts, I don't think, are too surprising, especially if it's a repeated assumption, if it's a daily thing, that can have mental health impacts for folks, whether it's frustration, which we identified in the poll question, a sense of exhaustion of like having to explain oneself or figure out whether or not to explain. And for some, it's just too much and they socially isolate. They choose to work remotely if that's an option, or they just don't bother interacting or socializing with folks in off hours. So this is a really tough decision. Do I say something and I'm seen for who I am, or do I just stay quiet and then I'm safe? So people are constantly thinking seen versus safe. And so that's where it's super important to create kind of actively safe spaces so that it's not this tough decision, and where people can be seen and safe at the same time rather than having to sacrifice one for the other. So having a deeper understanding, especially around misgendering, really any assumption, what can we do differently, especially when we're meeting somebody new for the first time? And I think this applies particularly for, operators where you're meeting a lot in the public, and so you don't necessarily know folks, and you're just a lot of people, a lot of new people, and so this is hopefully directly applicable. So if I don't know somebody, I'm kind of reminding myself when I'm meeting them, I don't know this person's pronouns, I don't know their gender, and I don't know their sexuality. And just that helpful reminder helps me then to have space for whatever is their true identity. And if I want to jump to a conclusion, I pause and try to ask myself the question, do I know this directly from them, or am I assuming based on how they look, or, a stereotype? And so just making sure you check in with yourself. There are also alternatives to, once we've paused, we can then, especially pronouns, since they're always in our day-to-day, how we talk about each other, we can obtain pronouns. So how do we do that? There's different options. So there's not kind of a right or wrong way. There's really just based on your own style. And so here are different options available, especially if you're just having a brief interaction with somebody and then you're never seeing them again. I tend to go for just use they, them pronouns for everyone. And it's just a really quick and easy way, no guesswork. This customer, this client wants this, please give it to them, right? And we already use they, them, singular, they, them pronouns for situations in which we don't know somebody's gender, right? This person left their pen, I hope they come and get it, So we're already in the practice, so this is actually not too much of a stretch. And what I like about this option is that if somebody does, say a non-binary person uses they, them pronouns, you're already there with them. So it's just like a win-win situation, especially for folks who are constantly misgendered. Another way you can do, if you want to establish a direct relationship, you can ask directly. I always like to add a little explanation. Don't want to assume. What are your pronouns? And then they either share it or they don't. We never force anybody to share, but certainly asking a question does provide space in case somebody does want to share. Longer interactions where you have a little bit more time, I either like to look around, maybe LinkedIn, email signature. Even in Zoom, you can put your pronouns in brackets. People provide that information already. And so if we're aware of that and looking for it, we can obtain that and we don't have to ask. And so it's a much more direct route. Or you can introduce yourself and share your own pronouns, in which case you've provided a setting in which somebody knows that you know about pronouns and also may respond in kind with theirs as well. So I'd like to provide a few pieces of information. My name is Kai. I'm the president of TransFocus, and I use he, him pronouns. And then the other person can respond, and they may or may not share their pronouns. And again, we really want to emphasize that for everyone, whether cis or trans, it's completely voluntary. We never want to force somebody, especially for, trans and non-binary folks. It's a tough decision whether to share pronouns, particularly for non-binary folks where sharing that pronoun kind of automatically outs them. And so they are doing a calculus that we want to honor and not push past their comfort zone. But similarly too, we also don't want to force cisgender folks to share pronouns if it's not what resonates for them. But there will be some pronouns that some people who want to provide their pronouns, and it's important to note that everyone can if they wish to. So it's not just exclusively just trans and non-binary folks that are sharing their pronouns. So many different options for how to share that, name tag at an event, email signature, or an Zoom. And why is this important? People are sometimes puzzled. Why are pronouns such a big deal? Well, mainly because of some of the experiences of trans and non-binary folks, but also it does create this culture where there is the option to exchange pronouns. It's not like a foregone conclusion. And by making a space for it, it actually creates so where it's not this big deal. So it can be exchanged and it help and support interactions. Also avoids the spotlighting effect. If it's just trans and non-binary folks, unfortunately, people stick out like a sore thumb, and it doesn't feel very safe for folks. But if there's a handful of cisgender folks who are also doing it, it adds this ease for folks. So if you feel if you're a cisgender person and feel called to do that, or you're already doing that, that's a really huge help. And it prevents also need for correction as well, because that will have already been established. And it's this kind of small effort for a fairly positive impact. Of course, pronoun sharing is not just for trans folks. It does benefit cisgender folks as well, particularly folks who have either a mixed gender name. I have a friend, Lori, who entered a running race and was put in the incorrect category based on his name. And they assumed he was a woman, and he won some prize in the women's category and had to return it. So, that kind of clarification I think would have been helpful in that case. Also, less common names where people don't know what pronouns to attribute to that could also benefit from that type of sharing. So there's added benefit beyond trans and non-binary needs. Last few slides are just regarding a gender inclusive language. So this is more of the practical everyday application. Certainly, probably well aware of ladies and gentlemen as a very common thing that we say. Of course, we're trying to be respectful and people want to be inclusive, but unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen doesn't capture everyone. And so it just captures men and women, but not non-binary folks. And so as a result, it's good to update or evolve our language to be more all-inclusive. So depending on, how formal the event is, you could say esteemed guests or good morning, everyone. My favorite is y'all, even though I'm not from the South. I don't know. Sometimes I need something very different from how I speak to help me make that leap. And so I find that helpful. But that's really important, especially for talking to an audience. Maybe we don't know everybody's gender. And so just to be on the safe side, it's good to include everyone. Here's a few more examples of that. Certainly there's the binary, so only men and women side on the left hand of the column. And then there's the more gender inclusive side on the right hand side. And I really want to be clear that if you know somebody personally, we can still use the binary side of it for individuals that we know. It's okay to, if somebody is a woman and they have a spouse or are partnered, to call her a wife, right? But it's if we're talking to people we don't know their gender, or to a group of people, we want to err on the other side, this column on the right-hand side. So talk about people rather than men and women. Or if instead of sir and ma'am, which I can imagine is quite popular, especially in a public serving service like BC Transit. But I will say, unfortunately, we do that based on how somebody looks. And sometimes we're mostly getting it right, but for the people we're getting it wrong constantly. And so that's where if you have a greeting instead of sir or ma'am, that can be useful. Or if you know their name, using that instead. Another common refrain is hey guys. That's a popular one. It's so popular that we now almost see it as gender neutral, even though it started as referencing only men or boys. So that's where it is helpful. It's a practice. It won't happen overnight, but just starting to practice with, hey folks, hello everyone, more inclusive terminology. Really important, especially for folks who are, on, the sexual diversity spectrum. Just referencing husbands and wives doesn't include all sexual orientations. So shifting to partner, especially if you don't know somebody, is really important so that there's more openness to whatever gender configurations are in that partnership. There's also family relationships. So we typically talk about niece and nephew, aunts and uncles, and so forth. It's good to have the gender neutral versions at the ready in case we don't know what the gender of the relative is. So tell me more about your nibbling, if they haven't mentioned a niece or a nephew, but that there's a kid of their sisters, right? Or their sibling. There's fireman instead of fireman, firefighter, and so forth. There's also gender neutral titles. So besides just Mr., Ms., and Mrs., there's also MX. So MX Dennis would be an example of like a title with a last name, and that's how you would pronounce it. So the last little bit here before we go to Q&A, so start to get ready if you have questions, so this is relatively new for many folks, especially if you're very used to using pronouns based on how somebody looks or assuming partnerships or whatnot. You might make a mistake just as you're learning and trying to do better. And as I mentioned, it's okay to make mistakes, but it is important to correct them when they happen. So matter-of-fact apology and a correction. Sometimes people feel fairly self-conscious about the mistake that they made and go on with their apology just to show how badly they feel. But that's actually counterproductive for most folks. It really then shifts that the 2S LGBTQI person feels like they have to take care of the person who made a mistake. So just, my bad, I meant she, and then carry on. And that quick correction, it makes a huge difference. And of course, if you do find yourself making the same mistake over and over, it is good to practice so that you avoid that mistake. It's important to do one-on-one with or without 2S LGBTQI folks. Sometimes people, they don't correct themselves when the person isn't around, but that's actually really important to help practice. In a group, really important to correct yourself because we don't want to have others replicate the mistake that we made. I had a dear friend of mine. We were at a conference with 300 people, and he was misgendered at the podium in front of the 300 people, and then he got misgendered the whole weekend long. So we want to avoid replicating the mistakes by correcting them once we realize them in front of a group as well. It feels a little uncomfortable, but it's an important thing. Next up, we have the previous slide was about possibly you making mistakes. You might witness other people make mistakes, in which case a one-on-one with that person, it's being supportive, right? We're not blaming or shaming folks. We're just saying, I think you meant they, them. Or are you talking about Drew? I think you meant they, them. And maybe you can offer support. Be like, hey, do you want to practice talking about Drew's pronouns? That can often help make that a bit more solid. In front of a group, it's a bit different because we want to work it out with the 2S LGBTQIA person, whether it's okay for you to step in to make corrections. Sometimes they want to handle those issues on their own. Other times they would love the support of others. So we just want to figure that out before we jump in. And so just sorting that out beforehand is helpful. So whatever you agreed upon, that's what you should action or not action. Okay. One more slide about coming out. So some folks will share at work, whether they're 2S LGBTQIA. And as I mentioned, it is an honor to hear that information. And so it's really important to thank them for sharing, ask them if there's any specifics, especially if it's a trans or non-binary person, there might be different name and pronouns. And then just asking them if there's any need for privacy. Like, is it just you that's getting this information, or is this more broadly shared, just so that you don't inadvertently share something that you shouldn't have. And then you just about intentional practice of any new information that was provided. It's important not to ask invasive questions. Certainly people are very curious, and that's okay. But people get kind of repeat questions that can be fairly invasive. So one example from when I came out as trans, people very frequently, wanted to know about medical transition. So have you had the surgery is a common question. There isn't just one surgery. There's probably a dozen or so options available, and not everybody chooses to undergo medical transition, and there's costs and complicated decision making, and it's a fairly personal, very private matter. So we don't want to kind of be too far into the weeds there, but really letting somebody lead how much or little they want to share. And important to note too is that we don't fall into the trap of expecting people to look a particular way to be themselves. So a common thing that happens is, for example, with trans men, they expect trans men to be all masculine, and that might not always be the authentic expression. Similarly, for trans women, for non-binary folks, people just automatically assume that they're always going to be androgynous, which is not the case. There are feminine-looking non-binary folks. There are masculine-looking non-binary folks. The expression part doesn't have a lot to do with how they feel on the inside. So we want to, not have those be forced to be aligned, that people can express themselves in whatever way is authentic. Because sometimes people go, you don't look like a man. And so there's this that's the societal norm expressing itself when really people come in all shapes, sizes, and forms. Okay, we're going to wrap up from here. But, we talked a lot about assumptions and what to do, what not to do, the alternatives for how to obtain pronouns, not assuming people's partners or the genders of their partners. If you obtain a pronoun, to use it respectfully. If you make a mistake, quick apology and a correction, and also helping others to make those changes as well.